Oh, thanks, Chance. Really appreciate it. It's always good to talk to somebody who knows their stuff. And again, big thanks to you for helping with the premiums. The last whole bunch we've been doing has been you've been in the control room helping with all of the technical side. And Brotherhood of Death would be the latest one. People listening to this in the future, as soon as that premium goes up for members, again, it's largely because of your technical skill and help with that project. So it's great to collaborate as well as chat. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's true. It's just it started so early, that love, of doing it, that we're, so many years on now, that it just makes sense. I think you and I spoke up before that. See, if you put a lot of energy into something like a piece of music or any kind of creative art, and this is creative art, what we're doing, it starts to own you. So it's very hard for me to talk about personal journey. It always was from the beginning. It's even more impossible now because it's not like a journey at all. It's like something is moving you. It's not your will and saying, okay, I can make a diary entry of all of this. It's like a flow, right? So in many ways, despite the dangers and the other, not even so much the dangers of being, beaten up or warned off or anything like that, it's just other difficulties of just having people that you think would be more supportive of your work turning out to not be supportive of it, or people in your family and other. So the other, and even in financial issues, the work it takes means that you have to work part-time at a regular job, and that's dead end. And then finally you have to give it up, which is very, very troublesome, anxiety ridden years, and you're getting further and further away, because then, with the whole resume scene and everything like that, you lose a job or you take time off, you can't so easily get back, because they're wondering, where have you been? And you can't open up and say, oh, I'm a conspiracy researcher. I'm showing about shadow government and all, to an average Joe, person who's maybe completely horrified by that statement. So there's a lot of other pitfalls in this movement. It's because you can't go along with the mainstream and really do the kind of work I've done. So it means that you're against the mainstream. They don't leave you any middle ground. They really don't. So earning a living in all of these things can become very, very, very difficult. But you're quite right. If I had tried to stay in Ireland and do this, well, you couldn't have done it. Jim Cairns will prove that, other people who've tried it. That's an absolute fact, because on both sides of the spectrum, you will be a pariah. And you could easily fall foul of somebody who's taken you wrong. And they're very violent, so that could, you end up in serious trouble by going down into any occult aspect of that whole Troubles period. Over the many years, there's literally thousands of people killed, and even during the Troubles, which started around 1969, 1970, of those thousands killed, and they were killed in violent bomb attacks, horrendous shootings. People busting in your door, running up the stairs, and blowing your whole family away. Just because and it might have been a very actually trivial thing, actually. Sometimes there were warnings, other times there weren't. So whole towns just disappeared, like Oma, for instance, as we mentioned that. But Oma is just one town that had I remember waking up in the morning, or being wakened up, feeling that the glass was going to go in of the house. And this was a bomb attack, over 2-3 miles away. The utter impact would just devastate whole streets and whole communities. And one time in the 70s, they blew up the gas works, and that just felt like Armageddon, because they set a bomb off, and of course gas explodes and stuff like that. So there was sometimes there was bombs left in your street, where kids, right at the corner where kids played. I mean, almost like deliberately left, where loads of kids kick the ball around and play at these little sort of halves or squares, massive Centex explosive bombs were let, and the army had to come and defuse them. And frightening, people were left out of their house for hours while they had to stand in the freezing cold at the end of the street, and you didn't know when you could get back into your houses. So it was like a kind of a war zone, something similar to what you might have in, say, Beirut, because there's other hotspots in the world, obviously. But this thing just went on and on and on for the best part of 30 years. And then before the 1970s, there had been troubles as well. And terrorist organizations also were sort of like finding what footing they were really on. Some were very radical left, and they moved to center. Others had been center, but moved more to extreme. Others were non-violent, became violent. Others were violent and became non-violent. So there was a tremendous move. I hope that came across in the presentation I did on it, because I wanted to give that feeling that these organizations never stayed consistent. You know, the terrorist organizations, they flux. There was a lot of flux. There was some groups that just never they were Republican, they were hardcore against the British establishment, but they never endorsed violence. And then there was others who said, without violence, there's never going to be any change, because these intractable royals or the intractable British government, without some sort of pushing back in the more violent way, they're never going to change. They own an empire all over the world, from South Africa to India to Pakistan. You know, they own this giant empire. They're hard to push around. We may be small Ireland, but we've got to fight violently. So you had your violent men come in, right? And that's not something I support, definitely. Definitely. In fact, you can't even really get off to the right start without it. Although we're living in a very Gnostic infused planet, where you'd be amazed how seekers, even after enlightenment or whatever, still fail to get that right when they're quite far down the road. And it can lead to a psychosis, as it often does if you don't have it together. You know, because you have to have your feet on the ground and your head in the stars. That's perfectly fine. But a lot of people have their head in the stars or the clouds, and they've lost their root, and the root being the body. But unfortunately, because we've grown up with religions that are deeply Gnostic, and I don't mean that in any positive sense, I think of that as an extreme pestilence of history and of consciousness, they've left that out. So, and in many ways, the relationship with the body is so necrophilous that a lot of people's spiritual journey begins in order to get away from the body. If you see that, so it's really bad. The spiritual journey they think they're on is actually, from its very start, something that is unsustainable, because it's some discomfort that they have being a self, being a body, that's actually initiated the journey that they call spiritual. Well, that's, and even history shows you that doesn't work. But unfortunately, all over the world today, you still have that. You still have a lot of people going into religions and ascetic paths. You have it in the West with the New Age movement. It's not all bad, but a great deal of this Gnosticism has entered in, well-meaningly. There was a certain Hermeticism, and probably there still is, but that's getting harder and harder to find. Hermeticism being a more sound, positive, and body concerned, sort of setting. I agree, like with a lot of that. Say, like, for instance, to give a concrete example, say Hatha Yoga. People will know what that is, right? Hatha Yoga. That to me is acceptable, within limits, because it is body centered. So, whereas Raja Yoga and some of the other ones, are not. They're again, practitioners may not realize it until later on. But you see, along these paths, you need to be very, very astute. You need to be watching the path. You need to be asking questions all the time of these different yogic paths that you may join. People just turn their minds off. But, when I was involved with a lot of this stuff, I kept asking questions, and I'm glad I did, because it finally showed me the underbelly and these constant themes of world negation, earth negation, life negation, actually. If you go to the extent of, say, an Alvin Boyd Kuhn, one of those great names, then he's talking about the cult of mortification, the cult of asceticism, which is by no means a truly spiritual thing. It's actually anti-spiritual. And you and I have talked about it with the cyberpunk tarot, because whoever invented that tarot, whoever created it, and I actually mean the imagery of it, they are totally possessed with that kind of thinking, right? Their thinking is in every one of those cards, almost an inversion, of how I say the Hermeticists who invented the tarot were thinking. So it's like a complete inversion, and we've explored that at great depth, and I know you have on your channel as well. Yeah, just as you did. And it's also, it manifests in consciousness as a kind of restlessness, because the description you gave is so deep. It's outside of our experience. We don't experience the contrarium as the contrarium, right? It's more theoretical. But obviously, just to even get consciousness out of unconsciousness, and actually to get self-consciousness out of consciousness, animals are conscious, but they're not really self-conscious. Some animals are more than others, but basically the animal kingdom, nature itself, is conscious and philosophically, but not self-consciousness. Human beings are well, even to get that tripartite change presumes a kind of imbalance. But see, when we say these words in English, it immediately sets people off in a certain trend of thought. In German philosophy, they don't come out that way. To talk about an underlying disharmony or whatever is by no means, a statement that is negative. It's understood as the flow of the Geist or spirit. Just like when you walk, right? There's a pulsation, there's a peristalsis, and so realizing that so easily we can get fooled by the language, these original German mystics who came up with the idea did try other metaphors. Jakob Bohm used the idea of a dark and a white light, which is very similar to the yin yang actually concept. He tried metaphors. He tried to avoid devil and God, all the traditional ones coming out of that was too extreme, because the contrarium is not just black or white in the sense of the way the Christians, because the Christians picked up on the contrarium themselves. But their iteration of it was puerile. It was just an extremely evil God on one side, a deity, and a very good God on the other side. And it just makes no sense at all, right? So many traditions are based on this, but they're also based on it trying to get away from it. So these Jakob Bohms and all were trying to go to the heart, Meister Eckhart, they were trying to go to the heart of religion and salvage what was important about it. Well, it didn't really work. They were heretics. Later on, the German idealists, 3-4 guys, and 5 of you include Immanuel Kant himself, like a sort of proto-idealist. They call him a transcendental idealist. They tried to salvage it too. One more convoluted than the other in a way. It's still in their attempts to salvage the truth of this particular aspect of metaphysics. Some were more successful than others, right? And so that's where that study then begins. But yeah, in general, the way on the most practical level, we experience it as bipolarity or polarity, dualism, right? So all the dualisms that we know, and we also experience it as temperamentally as a kind of restlessness. So you're quite right. Although there is a unison, although there are, you couldn't have body and mind. They're so related. This is the strange paradox of things. One contains the other. Right. In fact, mind doesn't contain body. Body contains mind. So there has to be, a jigsaw-like unity. But at the same time, there's this underlying, a tension. And then that tension manifests not just in body and mind, but between left and right hemispheres of the brain, and everything. Inhale and exhale. Joy and sorrow. And every man, and that's what Disciples of Mysterium was basically about. It went off in other directions, but the main idea of that book was to just reintroduce, in the modern age, this idea of the contrarium. It's not the word they use, but I don't even remember where I got it from, but it just seemed to me to be the right word for it, to indicate that. So it's a necessary restlessness, because without it, life wouldn't exist. Consciousness life is based on a disharmony. And this is the true Western mystical tradition. So all these other religions who try to frame it differently, are already deceiving you, right? So it was very, very important for me in Path of the Fool, in everything I've done, in various articles, and then what you're talking about, it needed to come out again so that we can have a reset. So if people, younger people today want to say, I'm a bit wary. I think there's been a lot of lies told in this movie. They're right. It has. So I was very conscious of that. And so, after 2009 or 10, when other projects like Architects of Control got out of the way, and as I stepped more, it was about 2010, we successfully did some very good podcasts, on psychology. It was a big relief, because I'd waited, God knows, 10, 20 years to do it. So, and I never forget, it was during the time when Alex Jones's, I think it was called The Fall of America, or whatever his program that came out at that time, that DVD, it was around about that time that then I did my first podcast on it. And right from the point go, it was very important to try and bring in this Hegelianism and this German mysticism, for people, because there's so many detractors and liars. Hegel is the number one most misinterpreted philosopher who ever lived. Everything people know about him, that he was a proto-fascist. He believed in the strong armored state and man subservience to this and the dialectic and all. It's all lies. It all comes out of a strain of left Hegelians, who really are Marxists, right? And all they did was chop off all the metaphysics in Hegel, throw that into the dumpster, and take a few of his, minor writings on politics, and then even inverted that. Brilliant. But the metaphysics all went out the door. The stuff we're talking about now, that all went out the door, because the dialectic is his commentary on, the contrarium, basically. And earlier than that, you had Fichte, who talked about the famous thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Hegel never used those terms. It was a previous philosopher. So, the misinterpretation of that tradition is so egregious. So I've tried my best, in episodes we've done on Hegel and all the trends, straighten that out. He may have used that term one time or something, and it was borrowed. It was just a comment. And each of these men had a different iteration then, an illustration of how this process works. But the misinterpretation, where did that come from? There was a need by some forces to so drastically misinterpret these men. Must have been for a reason. And I've always maintained this because they were talking the truth. So later groups, the positivists of England and the pragmatists of America and many other groups, what we would now know as the cultural Marxists or the critical theorists or the postmodernists, those types, the early version of that, were desperate to get people away from this German thought. So, I like to teach and write on that so that, we can counter. Because the other thing is that all of those other paradigms have fallen. Right. Doesn't that mean then that you resurrect the thing that you were attacking in the first place? It would, logically, if we had logical people in charge. All the other materialistic and physicalistic paradigms have failed big time, helped by quantum theory and helped by other things to bring it down. But still, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that we go back and dutifully resurrect the men where we left off. The tradition that was truncated because the lie mechanism took over. Yeah, well, if the lie mechanism crumbles under its own weight, isn't it just right to resuscitate that which was before? Yeah, well, we haven't done it. So in my work, I'm one of the only people that goes back to that, and says, well, okay, let's go back now before Marx, dig out those theorists and present them truly, and you and I, we've just done that work, back-to-back works, Age of Dionysus and The Moral Universe, exactly based on that paradigm, to bring back to the body politic, to the Western tradition. And I think it's actually vital right now. I actually think, especially for political thought, because this does have political ramifications. It is talking about the state, but it's talking about the state as a manifestation of everyone's understanding that you're living out the process of Geist, right? That you are part of the journey of spirit. And this is what needs to be taught to children so that they're aware of it, to end their despair, to end their solipsism. It's just me alone in the universe, or if you have deviant parenting, deviant teaching. There are certain philosophies in the West that were taught that no matter what happens to you on that level, you'll never lose your mooring. And that's part of the reason why these John Deweys and others had to completely sabotage German thought, because it was so utterly spiritual. It was so deep. It did sort of go around the byways, like with a Joseph Campbell, and it's snuck into Freud and Jung, and that's all great and everything. But you can follow the trend, follow the trails that they left, and it takes you right back to the philosophers we're talking about. But had that been a pure iteration, right, including people, many more names than we're talking about, say some of the Alfred North Whitehead, he was a scientist. He brought in science version of this that destroys, quantum, because there's still a lot of physicalists in quantum science who refuse to accept what quantum science has taught them, right? So say some of these idealists, their work had not even been stopped, prevented, or warped. The vision that I have of what would have been in the West is so illustrious, so perfect, that's what emboldens me to continue against all the odds, because it really is something quite pure, and this doesn't negate other philosophers or other philosophies, right? Because I'm very synthetic. I can see the connections between a lot of these things. There's a lot of consistency with other non-idealistic philosophy. But the very fact that idealism itself has been so utterly misinterpreted, and even champions of it today, the ones running around calling themselves, neo-idealists and all, they're not quite getting it right. I'm not that impressed by a lot of what they're talking about. It seems we keep missing the boat, because again, it's almost like they're focusing too much on the mind and not enough on the body, and not enough on Mitwelt, which is the German word for society, to reconstruct society. A good philosophy, starts with philosophy, but it works itself down right to the personal level. It's inclusive. Yeah, sure. So that concept, the mysteria, right, is just the word I use, mysterium, for one, and in the end, it is one. It is one big illusion, right? Because the mysterium, singular, would be the ideas we have about ourselves, like the one we just had mentioned about, right, divorcing the body from a spiritual framework of understanding, right? There's mysterium. But the thing is, from that one then generates all the other mysteria that we find both in religion and politics and daily life, you see. So, yeah. And so what that does is it's really it's a sort of a theory then, or a philosophy of deconstruction, because now you need to be continually doing apophatic work, right? Which is the next step here to get out of it. If your ideas have any kind of falsity, and it's not that they're all totally false, we're talking in a matter of degree here. An idea could just be 1% false, right? Or 90% false. We've had a really good crash course in the last 5 years in politics to see this mysteria in action, right? But the thing is that then you'd need to adopt an apophatic methodology of being able to check your ideas, not just your ideas, but feelings. See, because remember, the part of the contrarium is brain and heart, masculine and feminine, male and female. It's all around us. So there's a definite need to then have a more of an apophatic educational system that teaches you how to self-critique. And also that's very healthy. See, if you heard that, if somebody heard that in the wrong ear, they think that you're talking about some sort of, almost psychotic self-inventorying, to the point of obscenity. Definitely. Yeah, I see. So you have to start at the root. It's very, very difficult. Ayn Rand is very important in all of this because she tries to champion heroism, tries to delineate what it really means to be a self. So the word self is probably one of the most misinterpreted words. And that's where there's mysterium around that. Imagine it's like, bacteria or something like that gathering around a thing. There's more bacteria gathered around the word self than you could possibly have enough detergent to pour over it. But, the journey still must go on because we stand on the shoulders of giants like Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden and people like that. So the work has largely been done by these mentors. Ours is fairly easy. And then we have this kind of technology as well. So no matter how difficult things are, in this journey, I've always remembered the suffering and the difficulty of the ones who came before. Not all, some were, more well known and everything, but still they had difficulty because the world was against them, right? The critics were fierce, you know what I mean? So you just have to pick up the work. But yeah, getting back to the question, the thinking itself has this ability to think about itself, right? We're the only beings who can think about thought, think about what we're feeling, and double check our even feelings on that level as well emotionally. Some people have even now, neurologists are saying that feeling is the essence of all consciousness, and they're right. Because what we call thinking is, right, the left brain mechanisms are really just instrumental to a deeper emotive relationship with life, the attunement that's mood-based. And because that gained in sophistication, what we now know as the rational faculties came online, right? But they overlie. They're just sort of emanations, more sophisticated, like finer tools, for doing surgery, so that we can analyze life, logic, discrimination, discernment, judgment, right? All those higher faculties are like honed instruments, but they sit over, right? They're like strata sitting over a much deeper rapport, with reality. And this is then translatable into the right-left brain, where the right brain will be the part of us, in neurology that has that more omnidirectional access. I just call it, in my work, that it is closer to what's the template of wholeness. Right? It might even be the template of wholeness. And the left brain has moved away from that into different interpretations. And there's value in that as well, because all consciousness is valuable to an extent. It's only when you take it to extremes. Now, through the bad education systems we've got, the left brain has been catered to, and therefore it is now the master that's, used to be the emissary, as some neurologists call it. Now it's become the master, and the other master, the previous master, the real alpha brain, has become secondary in consciousness. And it accounts for why a lot of things are wrong in our world. So, and there's different other ways of voicing that. There's all sorts of different traditions. But it is a contrarium, and now the contrarium is something that's moving so much gel-like that it can actually polarize to total extremes, and then it can sort of, come back like mercury on a dish. It can sort of crash into each other, and there's eras and periods and times when, there is a sort of a harmony, right? But that harmony can also then be a kind of a deadness, right, in which there's no movement at all. And the polarity, which is terrible in one way, can also be a tension that's very needed for a sublation to take place. So there's no real, way of passing judgment on this, both whether it happens in your own life in these moments. Some people tell you, well, yeah, I had a breakdown. I almost went schizophrenic. And then later on they're going, but it was the best time of my life because all the lies died. That's what I mean. And the time when somebody's happy and 3 garages full of stuff and everything's moving fast, they're totally dead inside. So this is what I mean on the social and the spiritual level. Spirit, the German idealists were trying to say that spirit has experienced this. Spirit is a very dynamic, thing. And we needed to be taught the dynamics of this. Hegel was just a man who said, I want to stand up in the front of my class and teach this to children so that they're tuned in to the fact that when they have personal difficulties, right, depressions, miasmas, they're able to compute it in terms of the greater spirit. So they never feel alienated. Alienation was probably the most frequently word used by Hegel, right? Because they've left all this out, right? The things he really taught, yeah, well, you're never going to find out because they've gone off misrepresenting his work. But when you actually get back into what he was really talking about, it's something so utterly deep, that I'm afraid that, as much as I love existentialism and other things, there's still a lot of really great gold to be panned out of these German thinkers, that shouldn't have been left aside. And one of them is this concept of how to deal with despair, how to deal with depression. He believed that once you're united with your community, that everybody in that community has the same spiritual understanding. Now, this was left to religion, and he knocked it. Right? He said there's some stuff that's okay there, but basically it's so utterly, the wheel had come off years ago, and no, it's left civilizations, it's left cultures in the ditch. And then that fact, like I say, the bacteria that gathers around that then brings us into these Nietzschean despairs, right? God is dead. So he would, if he had lived in our time, he would have looked back at the God is dead period and all of that futility and pessimism of existentialism and laughed at it. He said, I know where that's all coming from. You guys needed me, because I could have told you that when you went off into the ditch, it's like rust gathers. So all the traditions that he saw of the postmodern world, or if he would have saw, and probably did foresee some of it, is this decadence, the nihilism of Nietzsche and others. He would have been able to account for why it's there. Because the real understanding of the thread of life has disappeared. And I make it simple in my work to just say that there's the stereotypical, the sort of mythical archetypal, and then the real spiritual logoic movement underneath. And that if you're in this, most people in the stereotypical have lost all insight into, the connections between these 3 cogs. And that the Hegelian teachings and all were to make you very, very aware. Okay, that was a little bit preserved in Joseph Campbell. They did great work. Carl Jung has done great work. It's not that it was totally lost to the West, but to all intents and purposes, it was. And therefore, now you're trapped within just the stereotypical level of existence, myopic, one-dimensional, linear, Apollonian. And then the rust that gathers then becomes scientism. You see, all of these things can be understood as going wrong because you're disconnected now from the mythical and even something even deeper than that, meaning you've lost the sensitivity because you're not being taught it. You've got John Dewey, you've got education, you've got all the foulness of it. And so the midwelt will start to corrode, right? Hegel was very, very worried. He wasn't talking about any draconian state or this nonsense that they're teaching you that he said. He was worried that the infections within, the midwelt, within society would happen because the spiritual underpinnings of it has been lost or misrepresented or just handed over into the hands of religion. And that's just a temporary salve. There's echoes of truth in religion, but the religious mind has become itself poisoned, through hierarchical control or whatever, the whole thing we know all about. Just this
supernaturalism, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It doesn't negate that aliens did indeed visit this planet at one time, but the thing is that that theory can be used in wrong hands or by a psychologically, basically remedial person who indeed does exactly what you're saying, and it wouldn't be the first time that the heavens, in all caps, was used as a projection screen for the psyche. In fact, that's how even astrology comes online, actually, in more of a positive sense. And you're quite right. You see, look at the ecology movement I'm thinking more of the Al Gore, because again, within ecology movement, there's a very sincere voice about loving animals, loving the planet. It's not that, but it's been used in wrong hands, in which the whole of the idea of climate has exactly as you say been used as a psychic processor, right? The inner ecology, the inner climate, the psychic climate is in peril. And so instead of dealing with that directly and holistically, we create mysteria, right? Which is you project the idea out there, and you become fascinated by that idea, and you go off into complete irrationalism. See, Ralph Ellis, or a much more unbiased climatologist or thinker, can show you the error of your ways, but nobody's listening any more than they are listening to the tens of thousands of doctors now about the pandemic. Nobody's listening. But don't they have medical degrees? I mean, Bill Gates doesn't, and all the people telling you to wear your mask don't in the city street. Oh, we prefer if you wear a mask. Well, then move away and you won't have any problem. Get out of my sight if you don't feel secure and safe. No, but we'd feel better if you wore it. Yeah, but then that feel better culture and that argument of I have to do something to make you feel better can be used across the world to destroy the world. You'll easily feel better if you piss off out of my way, and then you won't be having a problem. But those who fold up to that rhetoric, oh, I have to make you feel better. I have to make your emotional, I am responsible for your emotional setting. You're not. You just stand right there claiming you're going to be infected by me, and you're incapable of seeing your own mental process, how irrational it is. In fact, irrationality has been normalized now, you see. So this is the mysteria that I talk about in Disciples. It just exponentially gets created. How are you going to keep your focus, right? And I love all of these subjects that you're talking about in as of themselves as subjects. They bear thinking about. There's within there some very important stuff. But when you're using that as a sort of a foxhole in which to dive, because reality itself has become, you're in this reality. Well, now, yeah, you can be into all sorts of boogaloo things. And unfortunately, this movement does indeed, attract a lot of people like that who are, for one reason or another, looking for, one of these platforms that has attracted them. But again, they're not using that self-reflect. They just become fans of it. They just move in on a sort of one-to-one level without critiquing it. The apophatic aspect isn't there, which is what you need when you're doing my work. Everything I say has been double, triple critiqued. And I mean, in a very sincere way, in a very desperate way, where, my own life changed because of it, looking deeply into things I believe or what I've read or what somebody else is telling me and all of this. And we should have had that. I wasn't taught that, I just had it naturally, but we needed something that, does teach this to children and makes them read your Sherlock Holmeses, and the Conan Doyles and all of that, and becomes very deconstructive, because it's out of that mud of deconstruction that the most perfect sunflowers grow. And we've lost that in the West. We've lost any concept of what we're talking about here. It all has to be instant. It all has to be stamp approved by MIT or somebody else. And it has to be sort of, physicalistic. Without, because we call it...
And politically correct. Let's just throw politically correct in there too.
Oh, yeah. Big time. Or somebody would say, sure, Michael, all scientists do what you're talking about. You're just making a lot of hay about nothing. Science is that deconstructiveness, but it's not. It's not. Scientism is a paradigm. Scientism is already, like, even, Thomas Kuhn, the greatest of scientists, have already critiqued it. Not me. They said, watch out for the paradigm. Once you've bought the paradigm and you're in it, you think that you are then, the one who's got the great gauge of knowledge, the magician's wand, where you are seeing the world clearly. No, the paradigm has already shut you off from reality. Your materialism is the worst vantage point to be on, and it's just you within it, sitting at the wheel saying, I have complete vision. Well, how would you know? You have because the whole point of a Heidegger and these people is, no, you're not objective. You don't even know what objectivity is. You're living in the word again, like we said earlier, right? People live in the word, and the word becomes the reality. So the scientist has heard somewhere that we're objective, everybody isn't. And without thinking about it for another second, just wheels out that same, piece of rhetoric. We're the objective ones, you're not. Oh my God. So Charles T. Tart, he's wrong. Ian McGilchrist, Sheldrake, Michael Cremo, they're all equally degreed, if not more than you. And they don't agree. You see, so you have to marshal your facts. You're up against a paradigm. And that paradigm does not self-reflect. That paradigm does not go lightly, isn't humble, right? It becomes completely institutionalized. And then it asks you to conform. It's like there's no leeway. There's nobody from the outside. It's like you going to your medical doctor today and say, I don't like your whole edifice. Your edifice is so powerful that I know what's in your head, mate. I know you're probably a decent guy. You don't want to hurt anybody. But unfortunately, you are hurting a lot of people. You can get in a conversation like that with the average doctor. What I've said is just right. All that big pharma and all that industrialism behind him is his brain. There is nothing left for you to talk to that will go, yeah, you're right. No. And you could send him all the Dr. Mendelsohn books and all the naysayer books of MDs 10 times degreed than he is. It won't make a difference. He'll never change unless something personal happens in his life where, but that's out of your control, isn't it? If he goes through a rite of passage where somebody he knew died from, iatrogenic mishandling or from malpractice, okay, maybe that person will change. But you can't plot that. And as much as you want to say, I'm going to challenge you. I don't like what you people do here. You murder people. You're a death cult. You really imagine that you're going to get through any of these people? In England, because it's NHS, whatever, the NHS, you don't pay. So in America, where you can actually fight the system through lawyers, if malpractice was done. In England, you can't because it's NHS. You don't pay. It's part of the national service. What that has done is create an immunity of these people. They can do anything they want now and do the most egregious experiments and things like that. And you have no recourse. No lawyer will touch you. They go, sure, you got that for free. It's part of the white ritual, right? And you're going, what's the difference there? Oh, well, they didn't do anything wrong to you. So they got this set up legally where you cannot do anything to the NHS, no matter how bad the service was or who died on the surgery table or who died from a vaccination or medical. They've got a very, very system because we're the benevolent, humanitarian, untouchable. Try fighting us now. Try telling me that I did wrong. I'm the doctor. See, so we have created edifices through faulty thinking that are now gaining extreme institutionalized power over us, like your Michel Foucault, right? The Total Institution, like your George Orwell's, and even insiders like Huxley, who are part of it, warned you. Watch out what you're creating for yourselves. Very subtly, very beautifully, very in a very sophistic way, tried to warn you that you're bringing this about. And so I carry on their message that any kind of draconian big daddy or big mama, whatever form it's going to take, we are actually in many ways living in the shadow of it because we have conjured it by not listening to truth. When you don't listen to truth, when you don't occupy the white squares of knowledge, somebody else will. And that's exactly the dynamic. It's as old as the hills. No matter what age or epoch, you could be in the Roman Empire, and this is the way it works. Yeah, and an adjunct to that statement about imperfection, right? Honing in and all of that. The holism involves our view of imperfection. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist or that you should focus in it, or the whole view even sees the background for an imperfection correctly, right? So you don't erase. This is where the left brain went wrong, right? And the right brain's encompassment even sees imperfection as the grain of sand in the oyster that created the pearl. So that's what we're talking about, the contrarium. Both sides of the contrarium are equally right and wrong. So it cancels it out. It's beyond good and evil. It's something ontological, right? And it's only the left brain's myopic idea that goes, that's imperfect. We need science and pharmacology to fix it. So, we need to put earrings on the Mona Lisa. It wasn't perfect as it is, And so there's a part of our brain, this little gremlin, that runs around doing that. Now, in Zardoz, of course, that's all about scientism. That was a film that was beautifully done to show that what would happen if we really did have a utopia in exactly the way that the scientists and these other sort of Apollonian types, keep advocating. And politics is also a huge part of this because they're always
Huxley
talking about
and scientific dictatorship.
Yeah, basically, right. Isn't it? And in that film, they're also talking about improving life and living forever. And then they end up actually finding it. So Berman sets this movie in the future. It was filmed in Ireland, actually, County Wicklow. That's why it's so beautifully filmed. But his thesis there was that what happens if these guys, just let's imagine a community, someone like Logan's Run or whatever, that they kind of do get this, it's been ripped off by tons of other films later on, right? But this was a little low budget version. And it's really, really good because it does show you that what happens if that perfection that scientists and most of the world even signing on unconsciously for it, the man in the white coat, gets his reality. So the beautiful thing of that film was then it's a deconstruction of that. It's a sort of a Nietzschean think about what would life be like in that perfect dome. Blake Seven, certainly the pilot, is a fantastic, almost mind-bogglingly brilliant take on that, because in Blake Seven, the idea is you've not only got the perfection of the perfect community, you've got the police dragon, the police dog force that takes out the man who, in their eyes, goes wrong. Something breaks. They don't even they don't even see it as real revolution or renegade behavior. They don't see it as sane spiritual rejection of their system. It's just a fault in the glitch, a glitch in the matrix. And in that particular case, they call him a pedophile in order to, demonize him and have him executed or something. While they bring up this whole thing about accusation, which I always think is actually a fantastically prophetic, way of getting rid of you by telling you you're sexual deviant and concocting a lot of lies so that everybody just finds you guilty. And by the way, even in the court case that finds Blake guilty, there's nobody actually finding him guilty. It's a machine. Yeah, they put these two globes on this, sort of like what looks like a stylized justice, the scales of justice. They put the computer files there, and he just has to wait to go guilty. It's so inhuman, and he can't fight back or anything. And
we have that now with online censorship. It's just the algorithm.
It's unbelievable. And even his own lawyer goes, "You're guilty, you horrible person. I'm not defending you anymore." And he's going, "Come on." And then the whole series begins with this travesty when he's sent to this fucking prison planet. And there's an enormous spiritual, aspect to the next episodes where he gets freed by accident by way of a computer ship called the Liberator. And the ship is organic. So they get on there as kind of pirates. They're sort of like almost like invaders, like bacteria. But the ship, this is so beautifully done, right? Is it a ship or is it something more? Reads their deepest unconscious. These banditos who get on there, the ship, 4 or 5 of them. Well, the ship computer, so to speak, reads their deepest fears, deepest subconscious level to see if they're truly good people or not, if they really are moral or not. And it kills immediately, it destroys anyone that is, immoral by bringing up images in front of them of their past. So it does it to Blake and the people who will become his crew, and it finds them worthy. So they survive. And in the end, they actually are able to escape, the bondage of the planet Earth. They get saved from their servitude through this ship, so it's all this psychological symbolism, of the repressed function, and it's all Jungian stuff, and even more than that, an extraordinary comment on the unconscious. You see, so the idea being that the secret of your own liberation lies within your own being, and that the more and more people want to shy away from that, the more and more they'll go for an imposed kind of order and live in the dome. Blake falls foul of it, but everybody else is completely conform. They say that there's suppressants in the air just in case anybody should break. Because there are the Frankfurt School and all these kinds of people. They know that we do have pangs and we're not emotionally balanced, and they know there's criminal fallout and delinquency and child delinquency and all sorts of aberrations. So they're working on how to level all of that out. So you have Al Gore with his ecology thing, talking externally about something that's psychological. Now you get Bill Gates talking about vaccinations and biological unhealth and disease to awaken paranoia from within, to awaken, the simplest way is, again, I displaced to biology. You already sort of said it. I displaced to biology the worries that are really psychological. And thank you, Bill, for helping me talk now and process and think about, right, my deep emotional plague, but in framed nicely in Mysteria. Because that's exactly what they've done. And he's by no means the only one who's done this. This has been wheeled out again and again, and society's complicit in it. I think a lot of people are sad that the lockdown might even end. And again, you can always blame somebody else. You can always blame Bill Gates or George Soros. You see, there's this other dynamic involved in which, in the process of making a thing left brain thought, bringing it to the ego level of thinking, there's also a lot of projection and blame so that you're exonerated, of any kind of blame. So politics is a very, well, how did we say it in one of the programs? When you have no actual responsibility for that self, all caps, you vote, or you do charity, or you become a philanthropist. And if you're very, very rich, you become you become Bill Gates. But even if you're not that big, well, you'll donate to, Battersea Dogs Home, or, the poor starving guys in Somalia or whatever. All of this is nonsense, right? It's because you're actually wanting to still prove that you're responsible. You've abnegated completely psychological responsibility in the deepest sense of the word. But your ego knows you've done that and is drenched with shame over it. So quickly you look, to look good in the eyes of the world. And that's how I see this shallow, hollow. I'm not against charity by any means, but I can tell the fake version of it when somebody is in a deep state of compensation and displacement. That's not good. That's not going to lead to health. michaeltesarion.com for articles. I have about 14 different websites, so you can get to them all through the main site of michaeltesarion.com. There's all sorts. I like to modulate everything so it's less confusing. So all the different sites I have can be accessed from michaeltesarion.com. And that's also where the articles are. Free interviews, that we've done as well. So people can come there, but the premium content that you've been helping me with is also on unslave.com.